The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of O'Hare International Airport's Terminal B, casting long shadows across the busy terminal. Dr. Chen, a heart surgeon with 15 years of experience, was rushing to catch his flight to a medical conference in Boston. His perfectly polished shoes clicked against the floor as he navigated through crowds of travelers, pulling his carry-on suitcase behind him. He'd almost reached his gate when he heard the commotion. Through the sea of people, he spotted an elderly woman sitting at one of the terminal's restaurants. Something wasn't right. Her face was turning an alarming shade of blue, and she was clutching her throat, the universal sign of choking. Most people walked past, some staring but unsure what to do. A young man nearby was frozen, phone in hand, looking helpless. The restaurant staff seemed confused, speaking rapidly into their radios, but no one was taking action. Dr. Chen didn't hesitate. He dropped his suitcase handle and sprinted toward the woman, his stethoscope bouncing against his chest. "I'm a doctor," he called out, his voice cutting through the airport's constant buzz. "Please give her some space." The woman's eyes were wide with panic as she struggled for air. Dr. Chen quickly assessed the situation. She was conscious but couldn't breathe. A half-eaten sandwich lay on the table in front of her. Time was running out. "Ma'am, I'm going to help you," he said calmly, though his heart was racing. "I'm going to perform the Heimlich maneuver. Please stay calm." The woman managed a slight nod, her hands trembling. As he positioned himself behind her chair, a small crowd began to gather. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others watched anxiously. Dr. Chen blocked it all out, focusing solely on his patient. He performed this maneuver countless times during his training, but each emergency was unique, each life equally precious. He wrapped his arms around the woman's midsection, made a fist with one hand, and covered it with his other hand. With precise movements, he began applying quick, upward thrusts just below her ribcage. 1 thrust, 2 thrusts, 3 thrusts. Nothing happened. The woman's lips were turning darker. Sweat beaded on Dr. Chen's forehead as he continued, using careful but firm pressure. 4th thrust, 5th thrust. He could hear someone in the crowd saying they should call 911, another voice saying the airport medical team was on its way. But Dr. Chen knew they might not arrive in time. He adjusted his position slightly and tried again. 6th thrust, and suddenly, the piece of sandwich shot out of the woman's mouth, landing on the table. She drew in a huge, raspy breath, color flooding back into her face. The relief in the terminal was palpable. People started clapping. The woman coughed several times, tears streaming down her face as she gulped in precious air. Dr. Chen quickly grabbed a glass of water from her table, helping her take small sips. "Take slow, deep breaths," he instructed gently, his hand steady on her shoulder. "That's it. You're going to be okay." He checked her pulse, rapid but strong. Her breathing was normalizing. The woman finally caught her breath enough to speak. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely, gripping his hand. "I thought I was." She couldn't finish the sentence. "You're safe now," Dr. Chen assured her, patting her hand. He noticed her name tag from a conference she'd attended, Mrs. Rivera. "Mrs. Rivera, I'd like to check your vital signs, just to be sure everything's okay. Is that all right?" She nodded, still taking careful breaths. The restaurant manager had appeared with a first aid kit, and airport staff were finally arriving. Dr. Chen was about to take Mrs. Rivera's blood pressure when he heard a sharp voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Get your hands off my mother. What are you doing to her?" Dr. Chen looked up to see a well-dressed woman pushing through the onlookers, her face twisted with anger and suspicion. The morning sun caught her wedding ring as she pointed an accusing finger at him. And in that moment, what should have been a simple rescue was about to become much more complicated. The woman's daughter stormed toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the airport floor. "Step away from my mother right now," she demanded, her voice drawing even more attention from nearby travelers. Dr. Chen maintained his professional composure, though his heart sank at the hostility in her tone. "Ma'am, please let me explain. I'm a doctor, and your mother was just," he began, but she cut him off. "I don't care who you claim to be. Security. Someone call security." She positioned herself between Dr. Chen and Mrs. Rivera, who was still catching her breath and looking distressed by the unfolding scene. "Honey, no," Mrs. Rivera managed to say between deep breaths. He saved my life. I was choking. But her daughter wasn't listening. The crowd that had moments ago been applauding now shifted uncomfortably. Some began recording with their phones, while others tried to intervene. "Ma'am, you don't understand." A young woman from the crowd stepped forward. "I saw the whole thing. Your mother was choking on her sandwich, and this doctor performed the Heimlich maneuver. He's a hero." Two airport security officers appeared, pushing through the gathering crowd. The daughter turned to them immediately. "This man was touching my mother inappropriately," she insisted, her voice shaking with emotion. Dr. Chen felt his professional world teetering on the edge. One misunderstanding could destroy everything he'd worked for. He slowly raised his hands, speaking calmly. "Officers, I'm Dr. Chen, a cardiothoracic surgeon at City General Hospital. Mrs. Rivera was experiencing a severe choking incident. I performed emergency first aid. There are numerous witnesses." The security officers looked around, taking in the scene. One of them, Officer Rodriguez, noticed Mrs. Rivera's half-eaten sandwich and the piece that had been dislodged. "Ma'am," he addressed Mrs. Rivera directly, "can you tell us what happened?" Mrs. Rivera had finally caught her breath enough to speak clearly. "I was eating my lunch," she explained, her voice still raspy. "The sandwich got stuck in my throat. I couldn't breathe. This kind doctor saw me choking and rushed over to help. He saved my life." She reached for her daughter's hand. "Sweetie, you've got it all wrong." The daughter's anger began to fade, replaced by confusion. The restaurant manager approached with security footage pulled up on a tablet. "Officers, we have the whole incident on camera. Would you like to see it?" As they reviewed the footage, more witnesses came forward. The young man who had frozen earlier spoke up, shame evident in his voice. "I just stood there watching, but the doctor knew exactly what to do. If he hadn't acted so quickly." Dr. Chen checked his watch. His flight had probably already left. But that seemed insignificant compared to the situation at hand. He noticed Mrs. Rivera starting to look pale again and immediately shifted back into doctor mode. "Mrs. Rivera needs to be checked by medical professionals," he said firmly. "The Heimlich maneuver can sometimes cause internal bruising. We should make sure everything's okay." The airport's medical team finally arrived with their equipment. Dr. Chen briefed them on the situation, speaking in quick medical shorthand. As they began checking Mrs. Rivera's vitals, her daughter turned to Dr. Chen, her face now filled with horror at her mistake. "Doctor, I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I just came back from the restroom and saw a stranger with his hands on my mother. I assumed. I should have asked questions first. I was so wrong." The security officers were now apologetic too, having reviewed all the evidence. Officer Rodriguez shook his head. "Sir, we apologize for any distress. You acted heroically today." Dr. Chen nodded acknowledgement, but his attention was still on Mrs. Rivera. The medical team confirmed she was stable but recommended a hospital visit for precautionary checks. As they prepared to transport her, Mrs. Rivera grabbed Dr. Chen's hand again. "Thank you for not giving up," she said softly. Even when things got complicated. You stayed professional and kept caring about my well-being. That says everything about who you are." Her words hit home. In that moment, Dr. Chen remembered why he'd become a doctor in the first place, not for recognition or praise, but for moments like these, where he could make a real difference in someone's life. The next few hours at O'Hare International Airport unfolded like a whirlwind. News of the incident spread quickly through social media, with various smartphone recordings showing different angles of the rescue and the confrontation that followed. Dr. Chen sat in the airport's medical office, filling out incident reports while trying to arrange a new flight to Boston. The medical team had taken Mrs. Rivera to the nearby hospital for precautionary checks, but not before she insisted on getting Dr. Chen's contact information. Her daughter remained at the airport, dealing with the aftermath of her misguided accusations. She hadn't stopped apologizing, her earlier anger replaced by deep shame. "I've already called the hospital board," she said, pacing the office. "I want them to know that you were nothing but professional and heroic. I almost ruined your reputation because I jumped to conclusions." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "I work in corporate HR, you know. I train people about bias and prejudice, and yet here I am, doing exactly what I tell others not to do." Dr. Chen looked up from his paperwork, his expression thoughtful. "We all have moments when fear clouds our judgment," he said quietly. "What matters is how we learn from them." A knock on the door interrupted them. Officer Rodriguez entered with another officer and the airport's head of security. "Dr. Chen, we've finished our investigation," Officer Rodriguez announced. "We'd like to offer an official apology for how this situation was handled." The head of security stepped forward. "Your quick thinking saved a life today, and you were treated with suspicion instead of gratitude. We're implementing new protocols for medical emergencies based on this incident. Would you be willing to consult with us on the training?" Before Dr. Chen could respond, his phone buzzed. It was the hospital where Mrs. Rivera had been taken. The tests showed she was fine, just some minor bruising from the Heimlich maneuver. But there was something else. She wanted to speak with him. He put the phone on speaker so everyone could hear her voice. "Doctor," Mrs. Rivera said, her voice stronger now. "I just found out you missed your flight to a medical conference because of me. Because you stopped to help me." "It's not important," Dr. Chen began, but she interrupted. "It is important. My daughter told me she's been calling around, trying to make things right. Well, I've been making calls too. The conference organizers are rearranging the schedule. You're not just attending anymore. They want you to give a speech about what happened today." Dr. Chen felt overwhelmed. What had started as a simple act of helping someone in need had turned into something much bigger. A teaching moment, perhaps, about judgment, courage, and the importance of looking beyond our first assumptions. The daughter had stopped pacing. "Will you do it?" she asked softly. "Will you tell our story? People need to hear it." Dr. Chen thought about all the medical students he'd trained over the years, all the times he told them that being a good doctor wasn't just about medical knowledge. It was about staying calm under pressure, about maintaining your professionalism even when others doubt you, about putting the patient first no matter what. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll tell the story, not to shame anyone, but to help us all do better. To remind us that in moments of crisis, we need to trust each other more, not less." The airport PA system crackled to life, announcing the next round of departures. Life was moving on, as it always did. But for everyone involved in today's events, something had changed. A lesson had been learned, not from a textbook or a training session, but from real life, with all its messy, complicated human moments. 2 weeks after the airport incident, Dr. Chen stood at the podium in a packed conference hall in Boston. The medical conference had rearranged its entire schedule to accommodate his speech. Looking out at the sea of faces, he saw not just doctors and medical professionals, but also airport security staff, airline representatives, and to his surprise, Mrs. Rivera and her daughter in the front row. "Medicine isn't just about what we learn in textbooks," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Sometimes it's about being in the right place at the right time and having the courage to act when others hesitate." The giant screens behind him played the airport security footage. The audience watched in silence as the scene unfolded, the rescue, the confusion, the accusations, and finally, the resolution. Some people gasped when they saw how quickly Mrs. Rivera's condition had deteriorated during those crucial moments. "In those first few seconds," Dr. Chen continued, "I didn't think about anything except saving a life. Not about the flight I would miss, not about the conference I might not make, and certainly not about how my actions might be misinterpreted." Mrs. Rivera's daughter wiped tears from her eyes as the footage showed her bursting onto the scene, pointing fingers, making accusations. But Dr. Chen didn't focus on that part. Instead, he talked about the bystander effect, how people often freeze in emergencies, waiting for someone else to take action. "We're all capable of making split-second judgments," he said. "Some of these judgments save lives. Others," he paused, looking at Mrs. Rivera's daughter with kindness, "others remind us that we need to look deeper, to question our own assumptions." The presentation shifted to show statistics about choking incidents in public places and how response times can mean the difference between life and death. "But today, I'm not here just to talk about medical emergencies," Dr. Chen said. "I'm here to talk about trust." He clicked to the next slide, showing the viral social media posts that had emerged after the incident. Some had initially painted him in a negative light, jumping to conclusions before the full story emerged. Others had defended him, sharing their own stories of snap judgments and misunderstandings. In that airport terminal, something bigger than a medical emergency happened, he continued. We saw how quick judgments can spiral into serious accusations, but we also saw how truth and understanding can prevail when we take the time to listen. Mrs. Rivera stood up slowly, walking to join him at the podium. This wasn't planned, but Dr. Chen stepped aside, giving her the microphone. Her voice was strong now, nothing like the whisper from that day at the airport. This man didn't just save my life, she said, looking out at the audience. He showed patience and professionalism even when faced with prejudice. My daughter and I. She reached out, and her daughter joined them at the podium. We learned something valuable that day. Sometimes the real emergency isn't just the medical crisis, it's the crisis of trust in our society. The audience sat in respectful silence as she continued. Security officers from O'Hare Airport, who had flown in specifically for this presentation, nodded in agreement. They had already begun implementing new training protocols based on the incident, teaching their staff how to better handle emergency medical situations while being mindful of bias. Changes are happening, Dr. Chen added, taking back the microphone. Airports across the country are updating their emergency response procedures. Medical schools are incorporating this case study into their ethics classes, but the most important change has to happen in our hearts, the willingness to trust, to help, and to admit when we're wrong. As he concluded his speech, the applause was thunderous. But it wasn't the applause that moved him. It was the sight of Mrs. Rivera and her daughter embracing in tears, their healing journey on display for everyone to see. This wasn't just about a doctor saving a patient anymore. It had become a lesson about humanity, about forgiveness, and about the power of turning a negative experience into positive change. After the medical conference, the story took on a life of its own. Local news stations picked it up first, then national media caught wind of it. Dr. Chen found himself flooded with interview requests, but he turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in fame. He wanted the focus to stay on the message, not the messenger. But one morning, as he was doing his regular rounds at the hospital, something unexpected happened. A young medical student stopped him in the hallway, clutching a tablet with the viral video playing on screen. "Doctor," the student said, his voice trembling slightly, "I've watched your conference speech 15 times. I'm doing my thesis on emergency response and bias in medical situations. Would you be willing to help guide my research?" Before Dr. Chen could answer, a nurse called him over to the emergency room. A family had just rushed in. Their grandmother was having trouble breathing. As he hurried to help, he noticed something different in how the family reacted to him. There was immediate trust in their eyes. They'd seen his story on the news. "Please help our grandmother," the youngest family member said, reaching for his hand. "We saw what you did at the airport. We know we can trust you." That moment hit him hard. Trust, it was such a fragile thing, so easily broken, so hard to build. Yet here was proof that one incident, handled with grace and professionalism, could create ripples of positive change. Later that day, he received an email from Mrs. Rivera. She'd started a support group for people who'd experienced similar situations, both medical emergencies and instances of misunderstanding. She wanted him to speak at their first meeting. "Your story helped me realize something," she wrote. "We all hold biases we don't want to admit, but when we face them honestly, we can grow." My daughter now gives talks at corporate events, sharing our experience. She says it's the most meaningful work she's ever done. The airport had made changes too. They'd installed new emergency response kiosks throughout the terminals, each equipped with basic first aid supplies and clear instructions for the Heimlich maneuver. But more importantly, they'd revised their security training. Now, every officer learned about the balance between maintaining security and allowing medical professionals to do their job. Dr. Chen decided to accept the medical student's request to help with his research. Together, they began documenting similar cases around the country, times when prejudice or misunderstanding had interfered with emergency medical care. The patterns they found were eye-opening. "It's not just about race or gender," the student observed one day, reviewing their data. "It's about the split-second decisions we make in moments of crisis. How do we teach people to think clearly when they're scared?" That question led to the development of a new training program. Dr. Chen worked with emergency response teams, teaching them not just medical procedures, but also how to maintain composure when faced with suspicion or hostility. The program quickly spread to other hospitals across the country. 6 months after the airport incident, Dr. Chen received an invitation to speak at a national conference on emergency medicine. This time, he wasn't just sharing his story. He was presenting data on how better training and awareness had improved emergency response times and outcomes. What happened that day at the airport could have ended very differently, he told the audience. But because everyone involved was willing to learn from it, we've created positive change. Every emergency is a test, not just of our medical skills, but of our humanity. After his presentation, a group of young doctors surrounded him. One of them spoke up, her voice full of emotion. "Your experience changed how I approach every patient," she said. "Now, I take an extra moment to make eye contact, to build trust, even in emergencies. It makes a difference." That evening, as Dr. Chen walked through the hospital parking lot, he passed a bulletin board. Someone had posted the airport security footage still frame the moment he'd rushed to help Mrs. Rivera. Below it, someone had written in marker, "In emergencies, trust matters." He smiled, remembering the young medical student's question about teaching people to think clearly when they're scared. Maybe that was the real lesson in all of this. In our most frightening moments, we need to remember our shared humanity. Because sometimes, the person rushing to help us might look different from what we expect, but their heart is in exactly the right place. 1 year after the airport incident, Dr. Chen sat in his office looking at a special invitation. The American Medical Association wanted him to lead a nationwide initiative on emergency response and public trust. As he considered the offer, his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rivera. She was in the hospital lobby. He found her chatting with nurses, looking healthier than ever. She wasn't alone. With her was a group of medical students, hanging on her every word as she shared her story. This had become a regular occurrence. She'd volunteer her time to help train future doctors, sharing the patient's perspective on trust and emergency care. "And there he is," she said warmly as Dr. Chen approached. "The doctor who taught me that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our most important work." She turned to the students. "Do you know what he did after saving my life? He forgave my daughter instantly. That's the kind of compassion we need in medicine." The students scribbled notes eagerly. One raised his hand. "But how do you stay calm when people misunderstand your intentions, when they assume the worst?" Dr. Chen thought carefully before answering. "You remember why you became a doctor in the first place," he said, "not for recognition or praise, but to help people. Everything else is secondary." Later that afternoon, Dr. Chen walked through the airport where it all began. The place looked different now. New emergency response stations dotted the terminals, each marked with clear signage in multiple languages. Security officers greeted him with respectful nods. His story had become part of their training curriculum. Near Gate B, where the incident happened, he noticed a small plaque on the wall. It read, "Site of the 2024 Rivera incident, where a moment of crisis became a catalyst for change." Below were simple instructions for the Heimlich maneuver and a reminder, trust can save lives. His phone rang. It was Mrs. Rivera's daughter. She was organizing a conference on workplace bias and wanted his input. "You won't believe how many companies have changed their training programs after hearing our story," she said excitedly. "People really connect with it because it's so real, so human." Dr. Chen found a quiet spot to sit and watch the crowds hurry past. A young family caught his eye. Parents teaching their children about the emergency response station, showing them what to do if someone needs help. This was the real victory. Not the awards or recognition, but these small moments of awareness and preparation. A flight attendant approached him, slightly hesitant. "Sorry to bother you, doctor," she said, "but I recognized you from the training video. Thanks to your story, we've updated all our emergency response protocols. Last month, one of our crew saved a passenger using what we learned." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement overhead, a reminder for travelers to familiarize themselves with emergency procedures. Dr. Chen smiled, remembering how things used to be. Change was happening, one small step at a time. He pulled out his laptop and began drafting his response to the American Medical Association. Their initiative needed to be more than just another training program. It needed to address the human element, The split-second decisions, the unconscious biases, the importance of trust in crisis situations. As he typed, he noticed a young doctor helping an elderly man who had tripped nearby. The doctor's quick, professional response drew appreciative nods from onlookers. No suspicion, no hesitation, just human beings helping each other. This was the future they'd been working toward. His draft began to take shape. In medicine, we often talk about the golden hour, the crucial time after an emergency when quick action can save lives. But there's another critical factor we must consider: the golden trust. That precious moment when someone in need looks at a stranger and chooses to believe in their good intentions. A cleaning staff member stopped by his table. "You're him, aren't you?" "The doctor from the video." She smiled warmly. "My grandson wants to be a doctor now because of your story. He says he wants to help people like you did, without thinking twice, without worrying about what others might say." Dr. Chen thanked her, feeling both humbled and hopeful. The incident that could have ended his career had instead sparked a movement, not just in medicine, but in how people viewed and treated each other in moments of crisis. He finished his draft with a simple message: every emergency is a test of our medical skills, but it's also a test of our humanity. When we choose trust over suspicion, understanding over judgment, we don't just save lives. We build the kind of world we all want to live in. 2 years had passed since that life-changing day at the airport. Dr. Chen stood in the same terminal, but this time he wasn't rushing to catch a flight. He was there to unveil something special, a new emergency response training center right inside the airport. The crowd gathered for the opening ceremony was diverse: airport staff, medical professionals, security officers, and regular travelers who'd stopped to watch. In the front row sat Mrs. Rivera and her daughter, both now dedicated advocates for emergency response training and bias awareness. "When I rushed to help that day," Dr. Chen began, his voice carrying across the terminal, "I never imagined we'd be standing here 2 years later. But sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest waves." He gestured to the new facility behind him. Inside, life-sized mannequins were set up for CPR practice. Wall-mounted screens showed emergency procedures in multiple languages. But most importantly, there was a section dedicated to teaching people about trust and quick decision-making in crisis situations. "Last month," he continued, "a teenager used what she learned at one of our training sessions to save her grandfather's life. She said something that stuck with me. She said, 'I wasn't scared to help because I remembered the airport doctor story.'" Mrs. Rivera's daughter stood up to share her part of the story. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "2 years ago, I nearly ruined a good man's life because I jumped to conclusions. Now, I travel around the country teaching people about the dangers of snap judgments. And you know what? People listen because this story is real. It's about all of us." The ceremony continued with a demonstration. A group of flight attendants showed the crowd how to respond to common emergencies. But this wasn't just about medical procedures. They'd also demonstrated how to communicate clearly, how to build trust quickly, and how to handle misunderstandings. "The best part," one flight attendant explained, "is that we're seeing changes everywhere. Last week, a doctor helped someone on my flight. The whole cabin came together. People offered assistance, gave space when needed, and most importantly, trusted the process." Dr. Chen watched as families took turns practicing emergency procedures. Children asked questions without hesitation. Adults discussed scenarios openly. The fear and uncertainty that often surrounded emergency situations was being replaced by knowledge and confidence. A security officer who'd been there that day approached Dr. Chen. "You know what's different now?" he asked. "People aren't just standing around filming when something happens. They're actually stepping up to help. Your story taught them that it's okay to get involved." As the day wound down, Mrs. Rivera pulled Dr. Chen aside. "Look at all this," she said, gesturing to the busy training center. "All because you didn't give up that day. Not when I was choking, and not when others doubted your intentions." Dr. Chen smiled, remembering the chaos of that day. "You know what makes me most proud?" he replied. "It's not the awards or recognition. It's walking through airports and seeing people actually reading those emergency instruction boards. It's hearing stories about lives saved because someone wasn't afraid to help." The final part of the ceremony was the unveiling of a digital wall. On it, a collection of stories scrolled by, Real incidents where quick action and trust had saved lives. Each story was different, but they all shared a common thread. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they chose to help rather than hesitate. We can't prevent every emergency, Dr. Chen concluded, but we can change how we respond to them. Every person who walks through this terminal now has the chance to learn something that could save a life. As the crowd dispersed, a young girl tugged at Dr. Chen's sleeve. "My mom says you're a hero," she said simply. "But she also says anyone can be a hero if they're brave enough to help others." Dr. Chen knelt down to her level. "Your mom is absolutely right," he said. "And you know what? The real heroes are the people who learn from their mistakes, who choose to trust even when it's hard, and who remember that in our most difficult moments, we're all just human beings helping other human beings." The airport announcement system crackled to life, announcing departures and arrivals. Life went on as usual, but something fundamental had changed. In this place where strangers crossed paths every day, there was a new understanding that sometimes the greatest journeys aren't the ones that take us to different places, but the ones that bring us closer together as human beings.